Ahren Posthumus, founder and CEO of Momint, joins us via video link to weigh in on the steps taken by government to implement the Energy Action Plan in the country. Ahren, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on the SABC at this hour.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, there was a briefing, of course, a little earlier on by the Electricity Minister. Perhaps you could talk to some of the sentiments that had been echoed by him. The planned maintenance undergone since December, the sustainability of it all, especially as we factor in the coming winter months.
Absolutely. So I think the Minister addressed some of the progress that has been made to date. I think a lot of that progress, particularly on the renewable front, we've seen a slight undermining of that progress. From the previous comments on the Renewable Energy Action Plan, essentially stating that the government has found renewable energy to be a challenging sector. I think a lot of people in the private renewable sector find that statement confusing, as this is primarily being driven by private investment. But overall, I think we have to go back to what the 5 key pillars of the action plan were. Number 1, of course, is to fix Eskom. Number 2 is to accelerate private investment. Number 3 is for the procurement of new energy generation, particularly from renewables, gas, and battery storage. Then 4 is to unleash businesses and households to invest in rooftop solar, and this Section 12B and 12BA have been incredibly helpful at doing. So I think that tax exemption is an incredible step in the right direction. And then the last one is a little bit vague, I believe, to just transform the electricity sector to achieve long-term energy security. Those are the 5 key pillars. And I think to date, we've seen the government actually, go down a path where we are looking like this is being implemented. And that's one thing that I can say is, we've been facing load shedding for over a decade now, and it's a real issue. It's a crisis that needs to be solved. It's unfortunate that we always see the most action right up before an election, but we are seeing those actions come into play.
Well, thank you for those opening remarks, because on the back of that, just on the back of those 5 key pillars, and the Energy Action Plan obviously being gazetted last year, the energy mix, green hydrogen, is it detailed enough? The costing, the modelling that has been proposed, does it instill enough confidence in the energy mix, the scenarios that also have been proposed? Is there adequate funding that has been put in place from Treasury on the back of the budget speech? I mean, on the ground in reality, what are your observations?
Yeah, so certainly there hasn't been enough funding allocated to this. I also think that, again, looking at pillar number 1, which is to fix Eskom, also comes with realigning what Eskom's role is in the energy security of the country. And I've heard and seen a lot of other industry experts, both that you guys have hosted here on the news, previous experts from Eskom itself, like Jan Obenholzer as well, who we've spoken to. Eskom is only going to be fixed in a way that we understand that their role is changing. And if we have much higher private generation, which is one of the 5 key action pillars, of course, and we are seeing a lot of private energy generation, particularly rooftop solar, coming into the mix now, then that means that Eskom's primary role is not going to be energy generation. Their job isn't going to be to make power anymore. Their job is going to be to distribute that power and to manage the imbalances of that power. So, for example, you mentioned hydrogen, wind, and obviously solar is one of the biggest ones for South Africa right now. All of these are subject to different timing considerations, right? If there's cloudy weather or nighttime, obviously solar is not going to be generating much power. So therefore, I believe that it becomes a much more important role for Eskom to be, like I said, a distributor and a manager of these power imbalances. So having pump hydro storage, having battery backups, having mitigation plans in place to facilitate this private investment they speak about, to facilitate this energy mix that they speak about. Distribution and storage are going to be 2 of the most important factors, I believe, for Eskom to focus on.
And speaking of which, just from the sentiments echoed thus far, I mean, are the ministers and our president singing from the same sheet? Is that driving investor confidence and stability for our economy? I mean, there's also recently been the appointment of Dan Marukane. What does that add to solving the crisis as well? The minister in these briefings saying that there's going to be no interference.
Yeah, so I think you've touched on an important point there, and it's similar to the one that I opened up with, where we saw commentary coming out of the presidency stating that solar, for example, was a challenging sector for them at least, where we're seeing great investment and strides happening in the private solar market, particularly here in South Africa. So I think you're correct in saying that there are times where they're not singing from the same hymn sheet, and that is an issue. But from my perspective, as long as we see consistency in the legislation and in the tax accreditation that we're being given on these factors or on this investment, then I think we're going to continue to see growth of private energy generation and a decrease in load shedding as a whole.
Ahren, you spoke about renewable energy, and I just obviously the race to catch up with the globe as well. But just in conclusion, governments surpassing their own deadline imposed by themselves, saying that 2024 load shedding is going to be a thing of the past. We're dealing with trust deficits. We're also looking at the impact on the most vulnerable. What are you observing on that front, particularly because beyond renewables, I mean, the issue of nuclear energy has also come to the fore. In December, processes having been started for the procurement of 2,500 megawatts for new nuclear power. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I'm sort of a well-versed and educated enough in the nuclear space to say that it is a very good energy source that and that might be somewhat controversial. People need to, if you look at the fact, nuclear is a great energy source. It's relatively safe these days. It's relatively cheap. But the problem here lies in the fact that the only executors of a nuclear power plant will and can only be the government. And as a South African, I think we also have to be realistic, right? And this is why we've seen such massive growth and interest in solar, for example, because this is something that we can do on a private scale. This is something that we can take fully within our own control to say, hey, we're actually going to fund the rollout of renewable energies, more environmentally friendly, more sustainable, more on a rooftop. So, for example, what Momint does is we put solar panels on top of a school, for example, and they are directly buying the power that's being generated on top of their roofs. Now, that eliminates 30% loss in power that comes from just transmitting power across vast distances, which will always happen no matter what your energy generation is, whether that be nuclear, hydro, solar, etc., unless it's generated on site. So the problem with the nuclear proposals that you mentioned here are, again, timelines. How long is this going to take to even go through multiple rounds of ministries and investigations, etc.? And what guarantee do we have as the population, as the people of South Africa, that there aren't back pockets being fed in this tender process, right? And that's why, again, I think the most important thing for us to focus on is, well, there is this tax incentive that's being granted to all South Africans, businesses and individuals. That's the Section 12B and 12BA. Solar is a renewable energy that all of us can participate in. We have full control over it. It's not reliant on the government. We can put it directly on top of roofs. It just ticks so many more of the boxes than anything else that I think it really is going to be the leader in terms of this energy mix, particularly for South Africa. And I would encourage anyone listening to go and look into 12B and 12BA and see what tax incentives they can get as an individual or as a business. I mean, it's 125%. The government has made it, SARS has made it really, really appetizing, and it would be silly for us not to see those. And you asked about my on-the-ground experience.
All right, Ahren Posthumus, I'm going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you for weighing in. Government to implement the Energy Action Plan, speaking about steps and progress in a briefing earlier on.